Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hey, I'm Doc Frank. Welcome to my podcast where every week I'm presenting you authentic, spontaneous and unrehearsed discussions with interesting guests from the rail industry about topics that matter. Make sure you subscribe and tell your friends about it, as this podcast will both educate and entertain them. Thank you for listening.
Today's episode is an interview of myself in the Railway Transportation Systems podcast by the host of this podcast, Rahiman Shaik from Sydney. You will see that Rahiman is a really good interviewer, a very nice person to talk to, and I hope that you find something interesting out of this episode. If you like it, please tell a friend about it, and now please enjoy. Hi, it's Doc Frank here. Real quick, I want to let you know about one of the best CBTC trainings in the world, if not the very best, but you always need to be careful with superlatives. It's the CBTC Kickstarter online course. It consists of 30 video lessons, that's the 3 with the 0, in total over 11 hours of training content, talking about everything from the basics of CBTC, current standards, the benefits of CBTC, the key functionality of it, the supply industry, application tips and tricks, lessons learned, do's and don'ts, case studies, arguably the most comprehensive training that you can find anywhere on the topic of CBTC. A few additional things that make learning easier for you that you may not find on any other online courses. One of them being an immersion plan that helps guiding you through the training course and progress it in a finite period of time instead of just having it sit there for months and months on end. There is access to an online study group where you can connect with other students who are doing that training course at the time and form learning groups. And after the training, you will not be on your own. There is an alumni community that allows you to ask questions about the course content on an ongoing basis. So it's basically education for life. You can register on my training portal, which is docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC Kickstarter online 2023. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC Kickstarter online 2023.
Our guest for this episode is Frank Heibel, commonly known as Dr. Frank, a very well-known consultant, trainer, and conference speaker in the field of railway signaling. Born and raised in Germany, Frank has a master's degree and doctorate from the Technical University Berlin, and since then he has been in signaling industry for over 30 years. After 20 years of working for various global suppliers, Frank moved to the client side as a consultant for advanced signaling such as CBTC and ETCS, and has worked for landmark projects in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. Since 2014, Dr. Frank has become a brand name for providing training courses on CBTC and later ETCS. His famous Kickstarter trainings for railway professionals with or without prior signaling knowledge. Frank lives in Perth, close to the Sunset Coast of Western Australia. Hi Frank, welcome to Railway Transportation Systems Podcast.
Hello, Rahiman. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also thank you for what you're doing for our industry with this fantastic podcast. I like it a lot.
Thank you. Frank, once again, thanks for coming and joining us as a guest. So this is a generic question. Can you please tell us your professional transport industry journey so far?
Well, interestingly, I did not start in the signaling field, but that maybe is the same for pretty much all signaling people. At university, my major was in power systems, and I was earmarked to start a career in the energy division of Siemens, the big German company, multinational, but based in Germany, because they have sponsored my doctorate in that field. And when they invited me to a networking event, I was headhunted by the CEO of Siemens Transportation Systems at the time. They were growing like crazy and they were desperate for smart young talent. And as an ongoing doctor, I was just the right target group for them. I got an interview for the strategy and marketing department, but they didn't want another engineer. So I had another interview, which happened to be with the signaling division. And that interview went much better and I got offered a job. And that's how I started to get a foot in the door with signaling. And that foot is still stuck in the door 30 years later. I started to work in control system design, which I did for 5 years with my first management responsibility. Then I came to Australia for the first time in 1996. But was not so terribly successful because I was a newcomer in the signaling market that was mainly dominated by Westinghouse at the time. I returned to Germany and in 1999 got my first exposure to ETCS. Later on, I became the global portfolio manager for ETCS, but I kept missing Australia and eventually I decided to migrate down here in 2009, right in the middle of the global financial crisis. And I had a few attempts here to win a few projects and always ended up glorious second, which doesn't win you any business. And then I moved across the country to Perth and became project manager for 2 major mining projects. And since then, from about 2013 onwards, my whole career was all about CBTC and ETCS for city railways as consultant and then later as provider of training courses.
Wow, what a journey. Teaching is the greatest act of optimism, Frank. I truly appreciate what you've been doing and helping the industry. You know what, before interviewing you, I did a bit of research and I did heard that not just technically, but your lectures have marvelous sense of humor. Good job.
Thank you very much. I try to keep it interesting because I know how I like my trainings when I'm there as a student. And a trainer that's interesting and not boring is one of the key things which I try to replicate.
Yeah, agree. You know, coming to your core subjects, how did you get to focus on advanced signaling technologies such as CBTC and ETCS? For people who don't know CBTC, it's communication-based train control, and ETCS, European Train Control Systems.
Yes. So when I came to Australia in 2009, that was the second time when I came here permanently, I had already 10 years of ETCS experience under my belt. And at that time, that was quite rare in the country. So at some stage, I may have been the record holder in Australia for the longest ETCS experience. And so I thought I would get a job here as the ETCS expert from overseas. The problem was there were no ETCS projects at the time. So everybody I spoke to said, we would love to have you on board, but at the moment there is no opportunity, so come back later. So I needed something to do while I was waiting for these ETCS opportunities to happen. And I got a job here, and soon after I started, a tender came out in Sydney for the CBD Metro project. So that was an early predecessor of what later became Sydney Metro. And I was assigned as a package lead for the CBTC portion of the project. And that sudden immersion into the world of CBTC was quite hard, but I learned a lot. Yeah, and then in 2013, I got an opportunity here in Perth with the Public Transport Authority to help them with their planning for the next generation signaling. And it was basically a choice between ETCS and CBTC, and I knew about both technologies and could help them a lot. And then a couple of months later, I was contacted by a friend in Sydney to work on the rail system strategy for Sydney, which was also a selection between ETCS and CBTC. So I did the same thing twice in short succession. I gave a couple of strategic keynotes on advanced signaling at conferences of the IRSE. And all of a sudden, I had become the most visible expert in Australia in that particular field. And from then on, it was a bit of a snowball effect. I got a role as technical advisor for CBTC on Sydney Metro. Then I got a reviewer role on the Melbourne Metro Tunnel project. And now all of a sudden I was the only person in Australia working on all three CBTC projects in Australia. And then I got some ETCS consulting gigs for a short while in Brisbane on Cross River Rail and in Sydney on the Digital Systems program, which is their ETCS Level 2 rollout, as you know. And and it just developed from there. It became more and more and more. I really love working in this field of high capacity signaling because personally, it has always disturbed me that signaling was seen as the big inhibitor of higher capacity. Yeah, everybody said, we would love to run more trains, but the signaling system doesn't allow it, And with something like CBTC, that becomes very, very different. And suddenly signaling capacity is no longer an issue. So I like it much better like that.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. That's very intense. When you speak about CBTC and ETCS, when people generally start reading about it or learning about it because it is new in Australia, we got only 4 IEEE standards for CBTC and we got only 4 documents, that is 1474, 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas ETCS has got 83 subsets. So in literature wise, we got enough in ETCS area, but very less in CBTC area. So as a trainer, what do you see as main challenges for introducing these technologies in Australia?
One, I would like to answer first or to make a remark on what you said about the amount of documentation. It is right that there is much less standard about CBTC than there is about ETCS. And that's probably one of the main reasons why ETCS is interoperable between different suppliers and CBTC is not, at least not the Western CBTC from the Americas or Europe. On the other hand, the amount of documentation for ETCS could easily become a problem because people just try to cherry pick functions from everywhere. And then they end up with some functionality that originally came from a country like Portugal and some other functionality that came from a country like Finland. And they just don't fit together. And that can create problems. So the whole thing can become incoherent from a specification point of view. So there is some risk in having too much reading material for ETCS. And I've seen that before in projects. Now, with regards to main challenges to introducing those technologies, I think it's 2 things. Number one, you need a major culture change when you introduce these modern technologies, because what you're doing is not just introducing a new signaling system, you're transforming the entire railway organization to a high capacity status. And that affects not just the signaling department as it was used in the past, but it really affects wider parts and almost the entire railway organization, including people who never had to deal with signaling. And I think it remains to be seen here in Australia whether the railway organizations can make that change from the old world of conventional signaling to a new world of high capacity signaling. And very often, which is a big risk, is you've got a bit of a mindset like, we've never done it like this, And that's really in the way of introducing a new modern technology which works very differently. And the second challenge, I think, is that if you want to introduce high capacity signaling, particularly if you want to form ETCS into a high capacity signaling application, you need to push very hard. You need to have a quite radical approach. So for example, what I mean by radical, if you say, I want to do cap signaling and I want to get rid of all my signals, well, then you should do exactly that. You should get rid of all of your signals. If you say, let's just keep a few of them and then you keep a few more and a few more, and with every signal you retain in the system, your performance, your capacity will come down. Yeah, that's just one example. So I think these 2 things are really the biggest 2 challenges, the mindset and the required change process and a radical approach in implementation.
Beautiful. What an answer, Frank. Really, thanks for sharing this. I was actually thinking that CBTC is less helpful because it got less literature. You have opened up the doors of thinking. And because this CBTC and ETCS are very important topics, I would still stick to this topic, but let's talk in a different perspective. In my previous episodes, I have already talked to my other guest about the shortage of resources in our industry. What are your ideas to address this specifically for high-end technologies such as CBTC and ETCS?
I have a very personal view on that because I have seen from my own practical experience how something like this can work very well. And it requires to bring in a few very skilled specialists on those technologies, for example, on CBTC, similar thing with ETCS, and then basically use them as crystallization points for building up skills of other people around them. So what I did here in Perth, for example, is I was the key knowledge holder for CBTC and ETCS, and I had a number of in-house talent around me, particularly younger engineers, sometimes even graduate engineers, who were very keen to learn and very intelligent, very smart. And since I was very open in transferring my knowledge, I think they really learned a lot there. And if that continues for a few years down the line, they will become very useful resources and knowledgeable resources in their own right. So I think a healthy mix between established specialists and other people that are keen to learn, and then making sure that you've got a proper knowledge transfer, training on the job, so to say. Yeah, almost a silver bullet for getting more people educated, particularly in those fields. I mean, it may be a different thing for hands-on jobs like maintenance of conventional signaling equipment or something like that. But for these software-based digital solutions such as CBTC, ETCS, I thought the approach that I just outlined would work quite well.
Really intelligent thoughts and smart ideas. I really like it. Frank, with your intro, I told that you are a consultant. So being a consultant has always been challenging and sometimes raises questions about such as income uncertainties and many other things. What would you say your biggest strengths or weakness as a consultant?
Well, I would say my first and foremost strength is given in my name. It's Frank, because, I mean, you know, it's not just the first name. It also means to be honest and straightforward and basically telling it the way it is. So my consulting clients will get very clear and unfiltered and not sugar-coated views from me. So if they have an idea, which I think may not be the best one in the world, I may tell them about the likely consequences of those ideas, and then also an alternative which may have a better outcome. And then at the end of the day, it will always be their decision, but at least that they can make an informed decision and not come back later, why didn't I warn them of making a mistake? A second strength that I see is perspective, because I worked on a large number of projects around Australia. And I also looked at many, many projects overseas from a lessons learned perspective. And so when some clients, they are really adamant on having you like bum on seat for full-time 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week in their office. My clients fortunately always understood that I have several jobs running in parallel at the time. And the plus there was that I could always bring in the latest and greatest perspective from what other railways are doing. And normally my clients appreciated that kind of perspective and widespread market knowledge. And the third strength, I think, is that I have seen both the supplier side and the client side very extensively. I worked 20 years with suppliers, with several of the big names in the global signaling supply industry. And for the last 10 years or so, I worked exclusively on client side. So I've seen both sides. I speak both languages, if you will, and I am quite good in building a bridge between how supplier organizations think and how client organizations think. And for certain tasks and for certain challenges, this can be really extremely helpful. And it's also relatively rare. And well, if you want to talk about weaknesses as well, I could say I don't have any, but that's probably not true and everybody will know that and call me out. One thing that got me into trouble in the past was that I identify very much with the projects that I work on, and I'm keen to see them through to the end. But this kind of ownership and this extent of ownership by an external person, which a consultant, is sometimes really hard to tolerate for a government organization like a railway here in Australia. And that has gotten me into trouble probably a couple of times where my contracts may have ended a little bit earlier than I would have wanted it to.
Wow, being a consultant does not look easy. Moreover, it looks challenging. Do you generally work alone as a consultant?
In most cases, yes. Not always. There were a few occasions in the past where a client asked me for some consulting work, for some advisory work in fields that were not my direct area of specialties. Telecommunications was an example. So what I did in this case was that I have a network of specialists in that particular field. So I came back to the client saying, well, look, I don't want to do the work myself because people would call me out. I'm not an expert. I'm not known as an expert in that field of telecoms. But here is a list of 3 of the best telecoms people in that field in Australia. And you can pick and choose. I can get you all 3. I can get you either one of them. And then I teamed up with these telecom specialists. They were all happy to work with me. And I basically got their inputs together into a comprehensive report. And the client was extremely happy with that. And I think this report that I did a few years ago is still circulating in the respective circuits in respective city that I did this for. And but otherwise, my main work is working alone, respectively working in a larger team of a bigger consultancy as a subcontractor. But from my own company's point of view, it's just me working on projects.
Brilliant. Frank, I think being alone or working independently, I think you focus more. I think that's your strategy or that's your strength. I think we have covered the consulting part enough. So let's move to your favorite side, training of your business. How did you get into training field?
You know, I have done training long before I started my signaling career. I think I started doing training related stuff at the age of 15 or so back in school when I was teaching subjects such as math or physics to younger students, secondary school. And later I was a coach for a youth soccer team. I was a tutor for younger students at the university. My company, when I started my signaling career, they used me as a product presenter and educator for clients. So I was engaged in client trainings for our products. And also when we got VIP visitors like politicians or other important people, I was usually the one presenting our products and our product range. In Australia, I formalized my interest in training. I got a certificate in training and assessment. And those who know the industry know what that means. So it's a formal education on training and assessment. And my idea at the time was to provide an ETCS training for rail executives in Sydney when they did their ETCS Level 1 project. And I wanted to do this for my company that tendered for the project. And when we lost the project, I founded my own company, Doc Frank, and I tried to get a contract with the company who had won the contract to provide the entire training program for them. So at the time, they were talking about 160 training courses over a period of 4 or 5 years. And that would have been enough for me to do without my main job for the next 4 or 5 years and basically make it as an independent training provider. That proposal didn't happen because the supplier didn't want an external person to do their product training. But since then, I was bitten by the training bug. And in 2014, I developed my first training course for CBTC to make it easier for people in the industry to learn about that technology, much easier than I had it before. I started my first CBTC Kickstarter in Sydney in late 2014. And since then, I've done trainings every year. And in 2018, I added an ETCS training to that, which was also called Kickstarter. So it's the ETCS Kickstarter. And I did a large number of training programs in Sydney for digital systems, but later also courses in Brisbane and in Wellington, New Zealand. And I've done some additional smaller training courses since then. And just recently, I'm very proud that I got my very first training course online as a pure online training that can be watched on demand via video. It's called High Capacity Signaling in a Nutshell. It's just a bit more than 1.5 hours. And and that's my start into the online training world, where I hope I can reach a wider audience around the world. And
you would.
And the key thing of my training is, just to finish this off, is really that I'm trying to distribute signaling knowledge to the wider rail industry. So I'm not focusing exclusively on signaling people, trying to make signaling specialists to signaling super specialists, if you know what I mean, but rather having other people in the rail industry who were never involved in signaling to educate them that they have at least the basic understanding, and the knowledge gap between the signaling department and the many non-signaling disciplines is not getting bigger and bigger, but in fact getting smaller over time.
That's a great move, Frank. Especially the feedback I have heard about your training session from the industry is amazing. And I believe moving into training is the best decision you have taken for yourself. And moreover, the other question is, your training provides a way to enhance their current job, a career path, and enabling opportunities for progression. So you touch these two parts. Can you please share an experience in one of your training courses where you successfully taught a difficult principle or concept? How were you able to be successful?
I think the trick is really to think about ways to explain signaling that could be understood by a 10-year-old, for argument's sake. But somebody who really has a certain basic intellect and a basic curiosity, but other than that has no signaling knowledge whatsoever. And one example that I like talking about is moving block, the definition of moving block signaling. And for a while I have compared this to the offside rule in soccer. Everybody has heard about it. Everybody knows it's terribly complex, but nobody can explain it really well. And the thing I found was similar with moving block and signaling. And if you think about what a block is nothing but a safety zone, which protects a train in that zone from any other train elsewhere on the network. And so a moving block is nothing other than a safety zone that moves with the train. And this is something so simple that anybody can understand it. So I had people from non-technical disciplines, from the procurement department, from commercial, from legal, from anything. I had one person who has never even worked in railways. He was just at the training because he was generally interested in new technology and he was curious. And after the training, I asked him, what's moving block? And he could explain it off the cuff. And that made me so proud. And I really thought, okay, I'm onto something here. Yeah, if I can explain it like this to a person, even without railway understanding, let alone signaling understanding, then that should work for everyone. And I'm normally doing tests at the end of my trainings, and I think the test results are quite compelling as a proof that the concept works and that people really learn a ton there at those courses.
Amazing job. Listening to you for the last 27 minutes, Frank, it's an amazing career you had so far. So what's next for Dr. Frank? Say over the next 5 years, what do you want to achieve?
You know, my training has two legs to stand on. One is consulting and one is training. And at the beginning, it was just the consulting, and training came up later. But I want to keep working on both of these legs. I want to keep standing on both of these legs because, as you know, you're just a bit more stable standing on two legs than you are standing on one leg. So from a consulting perspective, there are a few very interesting things happening at the moment in the marketplace where my strengths of being more of a strategic advisor, making sure that projects are planned and set up correctly, could really come to fruition. So one of these big changes is happening in Perth. So they are now going forward with the procurement of what they call high capacity signaling here in Perth. And with me being in Perth and being one of the probably key go-to people for CBTC in the country, I think everybody would find it hard to understand if I don't end up working on that project again at some point in time, sooner or later. Another big opportunity where just the early days of planning begin is in Melbourne. They have had a recent shift in signaling strategy. So now ETCS is back on the roadmap and on the planning horizon, and setting up ETCS and doing it correctly for a city network is not an automatic process, and it's not easy either. It's possible, and I think we are seeing in Sydney at the moment for digital systems how it can work if it's planned really well. But Melbourne will have to follow a similar path if they want to be similarly successful. I'm pretty sure I could help them with that if they wanted to engage me for these kinds of services. From a training perspective, the next big step really is to extend my reach. So when I did classroom trainings live, they were obviously here in Australia in cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, and people had to travel to the training venue in order to attend the training. Now these days I'm doing live online trainings via video conferencing. So that allows people from all over the country to attend the trainings without traveling, but it does cause a problem for areas with completely different time zones. So, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, I did a CBTC training. I had one person joining from the UK. And for this poor guy, the training session started at 4 a.m. local time, which is really ungodly. You can't expect this from anyone normally. So he was really, really keen, as you could imagine. But if I'm going to a real online format where people can watch training sessions at any time on demand, then this whole time zone thing just evaporates. Yeah. So people from all over the world could attend the training, and I can reach even more people in other countries. Over the years, I had lots of interest, people contacting me from countries such as Egypt and Mexico and Brazil. So really, really far away from here and in very, very different time zones. The training, I could never offer them something sensible, but I think with online training that would be possible. So yeah, I think those will be the next things. And if I want to do them properly, then I think they will keep me well busy over the next 5 years.
They will, and I wish you all the best for your online format, Frank. And before I finish with my usual last question, what's your one piece of advice to our listeners?
I knew you would ask this question because I heard previous podcasts, so I had a bit time to think about it. And I know that some of your guests have cheated a bit by giving you 2 or 3 pieces of advice, not just one. So I would think if I only had to pick one, and this is a very temporary snapshot right now in these times after COVID and so on, I think it's important for people to be flexible and to have the courage to reinvent themselves if necessary. So if they feel that they are stuck in their careers, or even worse, if they have lost their jobs, that they can basically pivot and start something new and not just saying, oh, that's the end of my career, that's the end of my life, that's the end of everything, but saying, hey, I can change, I will change, I can start something new, let's just do this. And career changes in these days are very normal. Yeah, it's the new normal. I don't like this term very much, especially when it was in relation to COVID, but in relation to workplace flexibility, it is really the new normal. And quite often it's possible to make a career change while staying in the same industry. So for instance, a signaling person could start getting engaged in rolling stock, to deal with trains, or they could become a project manager and go into project management for a different discipline, but still railways. Or you change between supplier side and client side, or you just change cities, just restart in a different city, as I did a few years back in Perth after coming from Sydney. So these things require you really to get out of your comfort zone, but I think the only place to grow and to develop is outside your comfort zone. So that's just a place where you need to become comfortable with, or at least you should tolerate it, and that would help you. Now it's up to you to decide whether that was one piece of advice or 2 or 6 or whatever.
It's a great piece of advice. I think it's wisdom. I really felt as if I was listening to my teacher in school. It's really, really a great episode. I think I recorded a nice episode. Thanks for your time, Frank, and thanks for sharing your knowledge, wisdom, thoughts.
You're welcome. That's what a trainer does with you people. Yeah. Thanks very much for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you liked it.
I did. Thank you.
Hi, this is Doc Frank again. Before you head off, I just wanted to let you know again of the arguably best CBTC conference that has ever been held, the CBTC World Summit 2023, with 18 speakers from 13 different countries. It was a mega event in September this year, and you now have access to the official recording where you can see all the presentations, all the question and answers after the presentations, and even the VIP fireside chats that were exclusively for VIP attendees during the conference. But you can have all of this now lifelong on demand. You can watch it whenever you want, from wherever you want, and how often you want. Don't miss this opportunity and sign up to the best CBTC conference ever on docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC World Summit 2023. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/CBTC World Summit 2023. If you want one recommendation from me on CBTC, that is it. The best content of the year by a mile. Don't miss it.
Hi, it's Doc Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry, and I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share, and until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.